Boy, do we have a whole lot to get into on the B Block podcast. I am your host, Brandon Scott. I appreciate you for being here. Make sure that you are subscribed to the B Block podcast, wherever it is that you get your podcast, and that you check us out on YouTube. Of course, it is NFL free agency time, but that does not just mean that we're just talking free agency. We're talking trades, we're talking extensions, we're talking all kinds of different maneuvering around the NFL, but specifically when it comes to the Texans, I gotta say that this team appears to be very, very, very serious about remaking this offensive line and changing the attitude that they have of not just the attitude, but the attitude and the identity that they have as a team up front. We know that as a team, it was not acceptable the way that CJ Stroud was hit more than any other quarterback or sacked more than any other quarterback not named Caleb Williams. We know that a lot of the issues came from the interior and what they weren't getting from guard to guard. We know that their only good player was Laremy Tunsil, and even that wasn't always good because he led the league in penalties. There were times where this offensive line, and I would say more times than not, where this offensive line was just flat out infuriating to watch. And so we have the sequence of events from firing the offensive coordinator and the offensive line coach and promoting the assistant offensive line coach as the new offensive line coach to now getting rid of three of the five starters, or at least three of the guys that started, three of the five guys that started out the season on this offensive line, and guys that, you know, were either highly paid or considered to be a part of the Texans' future are no longer. Now, I got to say this before I get into the different moves that they've made over the last couple of days, and we will get into it. But off the top, I just want to acknowledge that I'm not in a space of celebration. I am not in a mood to be like waving pom poms and being the cheerleader for Nick Caserio and D'Amico Ryans just for specifically blowing up the offensive line. I do think, and we'll talk about the Laremy Tunsil deal in a second, I do think that trading Laremy Tunsil is a bold move and a bold strategy, getting rid of your most productive offensive lineman in the name of remaking and reimagining the offensive line entirely, whether that be just for the business decision aspect of it, or if it's about the attitude and the tone that you're trying to set as an offensive line. I will give them some credit in the boldness of that move, but overall, just the fact that they're blowing up the offensive line, the fact that they're making all of these changes, I struggle with celebrating them and giving them way too much credit for simply just acknowledging a mess that they made and trying to do their best to clean it up. Right? Like if I spill over this coffee that's sitting right here right now, my girl's not going to come out from the other room and after I clean it saying, "Hey man, you did a really good job cleaning up that coffee." No, she's going to be like, "Man, you spilt it. You got to clean it up." And that's just, to me, what they're doing now is the responsibility of the team is to acknowledge, hey, we don't want to double down on what has been a poor investment in this offensive line. I don't think people remember this, and maybe you do, because Laremy Tunsil was on the team and Titus Howard got his extension, and of course Shaq Mason was traded for and got paid. But like in 2023, no team had invested more in their offensive line than the Texans. Now, that wasn't still the case by 2024, but it was still essentially the same cast of characters, and it's not like anybody had taken a pay cut, which is a long-winded way of saying they invested very heavily in this offensive line, and it was an unequivocal failure. And it's not like I can shrug my shoulders at the leadership here and say that they didn't have anything to do with it, like they didn't have any influence on the way this offensive line was made, the way it was constructed. They either extended, traded for, or drafted the guys that were, or gave them extra opportunities to play the guys that they've gotten rid of. And so like I don't look at this as something that they inherited, but something that they doubled down on and actually invested in. So when you talk about trading Laremy Tunsil, when you talk about trading Kenyon Green, when you talk about releasing Shaq Mason, those are all acknowledgments, to me at least, acknowledgments by the Texans of what was an unequivocal failure. So y'all can do, and look, I'll be doing at least for the majority of the week, the drive with Clint Sterner. Ron Hughley is out. He's with his kids out in Disney World, I think it is. But I'm in for Ron. And look, Clint is stoked about it. Clint is excited about it. And he's not the only one. I hear from a lot of y'all, a lot of Texans fans, a lot of people that did not appreciate or like what this offensive line represented, probably starting with Laremy Tunsil, despite him being the best player. But a lot of people that did not necessarily respect this offensive line as a unit is folks are thrilled. And I want to be clear. I'm right there with you in acknowledging that this is necessary and that this is like just the kind of the logical thought, the logical thought process and the logical train or chain of events. I'm with you there. I'm just stopping short of a lot of y'all that are in a position to want to celebrate and wave the pom poms and say, "Hey, man," and slap them on the back and say, "Hey, great job." No, you make a mess. You supposed to fix it. Simple as that. And you don't get extra credit for fixing a mess. Now, I will acknowledge the boldness of some of the moves, and I will acknowledge that they're trying to clean up the mess. I'll give them at least that much credit. But I do think that, and this might feel like I'm splitting hairs a little bit, but I do feel like we should do a better job of, and at least this is what I'm trying to do a better job of differentiating credit with praise. They deserve credit because they are doing the work here. They are not doubling down even more on the offensive line than they already had. They are at least acknowledging as a failure. I can give them credit for that. I stop short of praise. Credit and praise are to me different degrees of acknowledgement. So I will acknowledge and credit what they're doing. I'm not going to be overly excited per se about the fact that they are in this position because they're in this position by their own doing. They're in this position by their own doing. I think is the fairest way of putting it. With all of that being said, and that's a hell of a way to preface what I'm about to say, I will give them credit for the work that's actually being produced by it, or the return. I should say the return that they're getting on the guys that they're trading. Right? Like I can't be too like happy about the state of affairs and what led them here and the reason why they're here, the reason why they feel like they got to blow up an offensive line that they invested so much money in, guys that they paid and guys that they drafted highly. But the return that they're getting, like Shaq Mason was, and we talked about this in an earlier episode, but that was just like an obvious decision. He was not productive for you, and you save money by letting him go. That was, a fairly easy decision to make. But the trade market, we'll talk about Laremy Tunsil in a second. But what the Texans have been able to get back for these guys is pretty damn impressive. And I'm not the first person to make this point. And I'm pretty sure that everybody that's paying attention and that cares about this probably feels the same way. But who had a Kenyon Green trade at all, first of all? And then who had a Kenyon Green trade yielding something of significance, whether that be in draft capital or another player? Like, I think if you had guessed, and I want to say Sean Pendergast made this point in some of his initial reaction on Sports Radio 610 earlier in the day, but I would co-sign this. If you were to make a guess on what's happening with Kenyon Green, what the Texans are doing with Kenyon Green, in some order, it would have been either released or the other side of that would have been traded for parts, traded for something, for a 6th, 7th round pick or something to that effect, if you could get that much. But you probably were not expecting the Texans to be able to get not just a productive player or a good player, but somebody that actually sort of helps change the makeup and the attitude of an entire unit. Like, I don't want to overstate the quality of player that CJ Gardner-Johnson is, coming in here as a sort of do-it-all safety, a do-it-all or do most things defensive back. Like, he can play any spot at safety, and he can line up in the slot. Like, he can do a number of different things, and really just brings this sort of tenacity, attitude, nastiness that you want associated with your football team. Like, just specific to this sport, you want players to embody some of the things that CJ Gardner-Johnson embodies. But man, most folks, I feel like, would have been fully satisfied with whatever they could have gotten for Kenyon Green. Whatever they could have gotten for Kenyon Green. And look, this is not to dump on Kenyon Green. We've done enough of that over the last few years. We understand that it did not work for a number of reasons. For one, the guy was not healthy when he started, was not in the proper shape when he started, took the year off last year. And then I would acknowledge this past year, his supposedly redemption year, he was playing for a coach that the overall coach, he was playing for a position coach that the head coach decided to let go. A dude that got fired. His position coach was a dude that got fired. And the years before that, he was either hurt, out of shape, or both. So look, I don't. This is not a dump on Kenyon Green session, but it is, like, just painfully obvious that it did not work out here and was not going to work out here. And honestly, if you're another team, there isn't a whole lot of reason to be all that optimistic about him, other than the fact that he was a first round pick by the Texans doing, and was a productive player in college. But like, it has not, there's not been enough good tape of him out there, and the most recent tape of him out there is so bad that the idea that a trade for him could yield you a player of CJ Gardner-Johnson's caliber is shocking to me. So I don't know what the backstory is, or what the underlying factors are here that would have led the and maybe they just wanted to get out of the CJ Gardner-Johnson business to begin with, that being the Philadelphia Eagles. But for the Texans to be able to land a player of this quality by getting rid of a player of, again, not to be disrespectful, but of no quality, of little to no quality in Kenyon Green. And I will say, again, the dude was always professional and always accountable for, what his shortcomings were. He was pretty open about it. But I mean, it's a bottom line business, and it just was not good enough. The fact that you were able to get a good player for him, to me, is remarkable. That part is worth celebrating. Not just the simple fact that you got rid of Kenyon Green, but you were able to flip it into what you were able to flip it into. Now, I am very, very, very interested to see what this Texan secondary looks like with CJ Gardner-Johnson in it. Like, the trade is Kenyon Green for CJ Gardner-Johnson. And I just laid that out, a non-productive player for a productive player. But on the defensive side of the ball, and you look up, Eric Murray signed a deal. He got money whipped by the Jacksonville Jaguars. But now CJ Gardner-Johnson is going to come and step in. And I don't know exactly what happens with Jimmy Ward. It was a really weird extension that they did with him. But I know that D'Amico is a fan, likes having Jimmy Ward around. I think in this role, and again, we'll see what happens with Jimmy, but I think in this role, playing behind CJ Gardner-Johnson and behind Kalen Bullock, like being in a position to, at 34 years old, what is he, 34, 35 years? I think he's going to be 34 this season, playing as a backup, I think is a role perfectly suited for a guy who is aging and has shown, not just in his time with the Texans, but even his last year with the 49ers. Like, over the last 3 seasons now, Jimmy Ward has been often injured. So not having to rely on him, but also I think still having him available to you, and hopefully having him be a lot fresher if those other guys, those younger guys, and CJ Gardner-Johnson and Kalen Bullock can stay healthy, and Jimmy Ward either help you in a pinch or help you in some specific nickel and dime packages where you have extra defensive backs out there and he's capable of doing that. Like I think that is really, really interesting for a defense that, let's be honest, did not need a whole lot of work. Like in terms of improvement in personnel, this defense did not need a whole lot. So look, there's a lot of talk out there right now about, do the Texans have the best secondary in football? I would need to look more into that and to give that a lot more thought before I'm able to just make such a declarative statement. But man to man, top to bottom, I won't say top to bottom because the depth of it all isn't necessarily there. The backup cornerback situation, I know they brought back Tremont Smith, but from, you know, Derek Stingley Jr. and Kamari Lassiter on the outside, with CJ Gardner-Johnson and Kalen Bullock as your safeties, Jalen Petrie as your nickel, and then your backup safety and potential extra defensive back in certain packages could be Jimmy Ward, if healthy. That to me is really solid. So I'm not waving the pom poms about the mass exodus that you're getting on the offensive line. I do think, like, I stopped short of that, but I do think you've got to give them a lot of credit for what they're getting back in terms of quality return for the guys that they're letting go. Now, that's the CJ Gardner-Johnson and Kenyon Green trade. The Laremy Tunsil deal, man, there is a lot here. I will say, just to kind of bridge these things, and I made this point on the drive on Tuesday when I was on with Clint. And if you catch this before I'm on with him again on Wednesday or Thursday, just know I'm on with Clint Sterner on the drive on Sports Radio 610 from 2 to 6. That's Central Time, of course, from 2 to 6, coming up on Wednesday and Thursday. I think I'll be back possibly on Monday as well, but we'll revisit that. But I made the point. The attitude shift and the tone setting shift, the approach, if you will, shift that you're getting from, say, a Laremy Tunsil as a leader on the offense to CJ Gardner-Johnson, which I don't know how much of a leader he's going to be, but just as a dude as a presence on the defense, the shift that you're getting there, I think, is significant. And I think that shift is also, not only is it significant, but I think it's also indicative of what all of the vitriol is that we're seeing towards Laremy Tunsil. Because I just want to be clear about it, man. I don't necessarily see it the same way, but I get it. I get what people are saying. Like, I don't think that you can, with a clear conscience and just in all honesty, act like Laremy Tunsil was not a good player for the Texans in the seasons that he was there. Like, he's there for, what is it? Is it 6 seasons, 5 Pro Bowls in 6 seasons? Like, and I know a lot of people want to kind of dismiss Pro Bowl appearances and say, hey, if you Pro Bowl is one thing, but All Pro is what you want to really measure things by. I agree with that. And Laremy Tunsil is yet to make an All Pro, much to his chagrin, if you will. Like, he thinks he should have been All Pro a number of times. And I might agree with him a time or two, but he's been a productive player objectively. And on a bad offensive line, okay, on an offensive line that was one of the worst, if not the worst offensive line in football last year, he was the best among them, and so to me, logic dictated that if you're trying to improve the offensive line, you need to get better players and not subtract the one good player that you have. Okay. That was the way I was approaching it going into the offseason, even though I understand the reasons why you would want to deal Laremy Tunsil both from an aesthetic standpoint and from a financial standpoint. I want to be clear about that. Also want to be clear about fully understanding everybody that says, hey, man, I want my offensive linemen and the leaders on my team to have a certain, to represent a certain thing, to have a certain approach, okay, to be something specific. And Laremy Tunsil, personality-wise and disposition-wise, and just the way the guy is oriented and wired, just is not like that, okay? He's not the guy that's going to go out there and rah-rah and give you a bunch of a motivational speech or speak or anything like that. He's not going to be the dude that's going to make you want to run through a brick wall. And honestly, he's not going to be the dude that's going to give you the sense that he's ready to run through a brick wall. Just not his personality. He's not going to necessarily do things extra at practice. He's not showing up to the facility at times where he's not required to contractually. He is a businessman above all else. Laremy Tunsil, and we've all acknowledged this and understood this, whether you liked it or not. Laremy Tunsil is in this for as a business proposition. Okay, and I think that is, for the most part, okay. I've always said I don't care what you're motivated by or what motivates you, so long as you are motivated and then ultimately productive, which I thought Laremy Tunsil was. But I don't blame people who don't like that out of not just their football players, but specifically from their offensive linemen and specifically from the ones that are supposed to be in leadership roles. I get that. That totally makes sense to me. And so I don't know, and I've said this, I don't know how much of that sentiment like is transcends it goes from the fan base, extends from the fan base to the front office necessarily, like how much of that they really feel. But you can't tell me that it's not something that they thought about, that it's not something that's come up. Laremy Tunsil's not here, and we like people being here, whether they're required to or not. You can't tell me that that's not something that, hearing D'Amico Ryan speak and seeing what he's all about, you can't tell me that there's not some kind of disconnect there, even if there is a respect for Laremy Tunsil's ability. Okay. So I've objected a little bit to like how it's kind of been positioned. I feel like it's been a little bit extreme on both sides. Like you got like this extreme side of Laremy Tunsil defense that I don't know is all that necessary, because I feel like the folks defending them, for the most part, understand where the tension is coming from. And then all of the like extra energy against him feels unnecessary as well, because you're acting like the dude wasn't a good player, wasn't the best player in that position group, for better and worse. Like this is one of those things where it makes sense to go in a different direction and try to reestablish things, but you ain't got to put no extra sauce on it, and I feel like I've seen a lot of that. Like I've seen that Laremy Tunsil wasn't a leader for this team. And I think what people are trying to say, they're just saying it poorly, was that he wasn't a good leader. They're trying to say that they don't like his leadership style. They're trying to say that he was a bad leader, maybe even an ineffective leader. That's what they're trying to say. But instead, because they don't like his leadership style, because they don't like the fact that he was a leader, they're saying that he was one. He wasn't one. And maybe this is just a podcast where I do a bunch of splitting hairs, but there is a difference to me between bad leadership and an absence of leadership. And that's where this debate actually gets interesting, because to me, nobody in that building would question whether that dude was a leader on the team. He was a captain. He was a Pro Bowler. He was a veteran. He was a dude that reset the market at his position twice. And you want to talk about the stuff that people respect in a locker room, or what people respect around the league. It's when you show a consistent ability to get paid, that you're good enough to get paid and reset the market at your position. You better believe that Laremy Tunsil, to some degree, had quite a bit of respect in that building. The key part and the interesting part is, how much did the Texans brass like that or dislike that? The fact that he was a leader, the fact that he was the tone setter, and that wasn't exactly necessarily the tone that they wanted to set. Maybe they didn't want their offensive linemen or their team in general to feel like, you know what, Once you become a vet, once you get paid, you don't really need to show up. You don't have to show up when you only have to show up when it's absolutely contractually required to show up. You don't have to do anything extra after practice. You don't have to try to motivate your other teammates or mentor your other teammates or anything like that. You don't have to go the extra mile above and beyond. Like, how much of the fan resentment for that, number one, was a complete and total reality, and how much of that extends to the actual front office and what they thought of Laremy Tunsil? That is the part that I find a little bit interesting, and I would make an educated guess that the front office shared some of that, liking Laremy Tunsil, but also wanting a different tone set on that offense and within that group. And Clint made this point today as well. Like, giving your first year offensive coordinator, new offensive coordinator, and your new offensive line coach a clean slate, an opportunity to actually be the leading voices and the leading influences within that group. Which, if Laremy Tunsil is still there, whether you like it or not, that's the leading voice and that's the leading influence in that group, because he's Laremy Tunsil and he's more accomplished than anybody that they've had calling plays or that they've had coaching the offensive line. That's just a fact. How do you like that is the question. And my guess is that the Texans didn't necessarily love it. Another point that I think is important with the Tunsil thing, and I've been making this point, hell, when they first traded for him, and since he's been here, since I've made the case for not trading him away, I have been pretty consistent with this much. I don't think that you need an offensive lineman as good as Laremy Tunsil to have a good offensive line. You do not need an offensive lineman as good as Laremy Tunsil to have a good offensive line. Would you like for your left tackle to be as good as Laremy Tunsil? Sure. Would you like all five of your offensive linemen to play at the level that he plays at in terms of just quality of play at left tackle? Would you like that across the board? I'm not talking about tone setting and attitude and approach and all that. I'm just talking about quality of player. Would you like that across the board? All five of your offensive linemen? Absolutely. But do you need your offensive linemen, any of them, any one of them, to be that good, that highly paid? I don't think so. I don't think so. And the lesson learned is that even having one ain't necessarily good enough to save you. You know, it's not one of those units where, like, if you have one great wide receiver, maybe that can make up for the fact that you don't have too many other good ones. You can do that. If you've got one shutdown corner, you can make up for the fact that the guy on the other side and the rest of the secondary isn't necessarily that. If you've got one badass defensive lineman, whether on the edge or on the inside, you can't have everybody else be bad, but you can survive with like one stud and a bunch of jags. You need on your offensive line everybody to be better than what the three guys were on the interior last year, while at the same time needing no one to necessarily be as good as Laremy Tunsil. You need competence, you need communication, you need cohesion, you need coaching, you need execution, but you don't need to be an elite talent. You just got to make all those other things that I just mentioned come together. And so might it be that the Texans have decided that rather than pay one offensive lineman as much money as Laremy Tunsil makes, because let's just be honest, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have an offensive lineman be paid this much if the offensive line overall ain't even that good. So now the new approach could be, instead of paying one guy that much, why don't we spread the money around a little bit and just get a really good collection of five guys? Because one good one and maybe one all right one and three bad ones is a no-go. 5 I ones can get you somewhere. That's the way our offensive line work. So, I think there are different layers to the Laremy Tunsil trade. I think on the surface of it, it looks and is a bold move because you are dealing away your best offensive lineman. But I think when you peel the layer back, there is a financial component to this where you save 40 something $million over the next couple of years. I think close to 14 million this year. So you can work with that to try to figure out how you're gonna fill some of the other gaps on the team. There's that financial component. And then there's just the whole reset culture thing, which is often overstated, but is an actual thing that the Texans are being faced with right now because they're changing the coaching staff or at least that part of the coaching staff, the offensive coordinator and the offensive line coach. And the offensive line itself wasn't good last year. Hasn't been good. It was actually a massive disappointment. So yeah, man, it is it is an interesting time. It is and really interesting to watch all of y'all respond to it because you got people calling Laremy Tunsil soft because he wears designer clothes and man bags and is out here showing on Instagram his Beyonce autographed cleats in the same game in which they lost 31-2. Not a great look. Not a great look. Certainly not for leadership. Certainly not for griminess, grittiness, toughness. You want your offensive line to be ass kicked. Like the folks that's defending Laremy Tunsil and going at the folks that's celebrating this whole thing, don't act like you don't know what they're talking about. All right. Because I'm more along the lines of, hey, keep all the good players that you can for as long as you can. But don't act like you don't know what these people talking about when they say, hey, man, I want a particular ethos with my offensive line. I want a particular nastiness and griminess from my offensive line that this one did not embody at any point. And then with the Laremy Tunsil deal, I was saying that the parts of this that I am willing to celebrate, not willing to celebrate the fact that they have just simply taken a mop to their own spill, that they're cleaning up their own mess. Nah, you supposed to do that. My kids clean their room. They don't get a ribbon. They don't get candy. They just clean the damn room, when they actually clean the damn room. But you see what I'm saying? But with the Tunsil deal, I will celebrate getting quality return. Again, I think this is important to point out. Getting quality return for Laremy Tunsil. The Texans get back 4 draft picks, a 3rd and a 7th this year, a 2nd and a 4th next year. That's 4 shots at getting a player. 2 really good shots at getting a good player with the 3rd and the 2nd this year and next. And then, of course, all the picks themselves are potential trade pieces to acquire a player of some caliber. If it's not, offensive line, to just acquire some kind of, they are chess pieces. So to get 4 of those in exchange for Laremy Tunsil, I don't think it's necessarily like a huge haul, but I'm good with it. I think Texans fans should be good with it. I think that's pretty solid to get back for Laremy Tunsil to get out of, and I'm not sure how much of the contract that they're paying or what exactly the money dynamics are, but I know that they're saving the 14. Yeah, they're saving the 14. This last time I checked on this, and I'll get with Texans Cap to check me on this if I'm wrong. But and Texans Cap is Troy Chapman. You should definitely check him out on all things salary cap, especially when it comes to the Texans. But my understanding is that they're going to save close to 14 million this year, and right around 43 million over the next couple of years. If I'm wrong about that, Texans Cap, feel free to check me. Somebody feel free to check me. But that part of it, plus 4 shots at either getting a good player with those picks or using those picks to go add to your team, pretty damn good. So I will tip the cap and I will celebrate the Texans brass for doing those things. Another thing that I want to celebrate from their offseason that I have not been able to react to, and that it's funny, man. The news that takes over the cycle and renders old news fairly insignificant, right? The Christian Kirk signing is gonna go down now as like a non-event, for like the rest of the offseason, maybe until the draft. But I feel like we're not gonna do a whole lot of Christian Kirk talk and discussion or thought really until we get closer to OTAs and things like that. Once we lay eyes on Christian Kirk out there, this is gonna go. I don't want to say under the radar per se, because it was one of the earlier moves that they made, and it was and is at a position of need. And he is an accomplished and significant player, I think, especially in the slot. But I am a fan of this move, and I don't believe in, like, I've heard that they still need to go find their number 2 receiver. Like, I've heard people say that Christian Kirk alone is not enough in terms of like moving the needle. Like, you need it. You're losing Tank Dell to injury. Probably not going to get him back next year. Tank Dell, by the way, just recently had surgery over the past week. Another surgery because he tore basically all the CLs in his knee. Not getting him back. And of course, Stephon Diggs is out there in free agency. You need to replace both of those guys. Not to mention, I know we don't talk about this about Robert Woods, but like he's gone. So you got and after those guys, I would say, after the big 3, you can feel free to disagree with this because I know like a lot of people just would rather have the younger guys out there, whether it's John Mechie or Xavier Hutchinson. But I trusted Robert Woods outside of the big 3 being Nico Collins, Tank Dell, and Stephon Diggs. I trusted Robert Woods the most out of everybody else. They don't have him either. So at that position, they had a lot of work to do and still have some work to do. But I still think that Christian Kirk as their slot receiver is a pretty damn good addition. And I don't want to automatically say that they still need to go find their number 2 receiver. It can absolutely be that their number 2 receiver just happens to play the majority of his snaps in the slot. I could see that being the case. Now, if you just want to say they need to go get another receiver opposite of Nico Collins, primarily, who's going to line up on the outside, who is not named Xavier Hutchinson or John Mechie, I'll entertain that and I'll hear that. But I don't think that dude necessarily, like, he probably needs to be better than those 2 guys, but he doesn't necessarily need to be better than Christian Kirk on the face of it, or necessarily need to be the number 2 wide receiver. He just needs to be the other guy on the other side. But Christian Kirk is fully capable of being your number 2 receiver, from what I can tell, from what I've watched, both his time in Arizona and certainly when he was healthy in Jacksonville. Fully capable of being your number 2 option among the receivers. And I think you'd like to get more from the tight end position this year. I think you'd like to get more there and maybe put a pin on that, put a pin in that and see what that's hitting for. What is the tight end room gonna look like, either personnel wise or under the coaching of Nick Caley, who once coached tight ends? Like that, I think that's a kind of a part of this when we talk about pass catching options and the hierarchy and the priority. What do you have at that position as well? That was a letdown position. Like you were unhealthy at the wide receiver position, even though you felt good about the talent that you had. You just didn't have those guys together for more than 5 games, I think. But you just flat out got let down by the tight end group. I think you like Kay Stover as a rookie, but he was a rookie who's still fairly new at that point, was still fairly new to the position. You didn't get nearly enough out of the guy that you extended at that position. So I'm just as concerned about the tight end production as I am what the Texans do personnel wise with the wide receiver opposite of Nico Collins. I also think that Nico Collins and Christian Kirk are guys that can line up inside and out. So, and Christian Kirk, to be clear, does his best work in the slot, so he'll probably be your slot guy. But it's not like you got to put either guy. I don't feel like either guy is so specific that you got to put them in a box. I don't believe that. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they'll prove me wrong, but I don't believe that. I think that Christian Kirk in this role should ball out. I'm interested to see what and look. This is somebody they signed early, or I should say, brought in early, traded for early in this whole process. I think that that's somebody that they clearly thought highly of and targeted and have a I don't want to say super specific, but a fairly specific plan for. I like the Christian Kirk signing. I mentioned it on the air, on In the Loop, weeks before free agency started. Thought it made a lot of sense. Whether that had been trading for him or signing him, thought bringing him in made a lot of sense. So I'm really curious to see what that's going to look like for this squad. Got a handful of other NFL moves that I want to touch on and want to try to do it quickly here as we get through this edition of the B Block podcast. A lot of big NFL news, and I'm not gonna hit on all of it, just the ones that the headlines that really stood out to me over the last several days. I'll start with Myles Garrett. Myles Garrett standing on a different kind of business. This was really fun, a really fun story to me because, as we all know, Myles Garrett had somewhat agitated for a trade, had demanded a trade. I saw Myles Garrett on Radio Row quite a bit during Super Bowl week or in the week leading up to the Super Bowl out in New Orleans. And he was out there openly talking about the issues in Cleveland and his intentions to be traded, or his desire at least to be traded. And look, man, money talks. Let's not act like money does not talk and that is not the bottom line in everything. Like Myles Garrett, I am 100% on his side and think that this was a brilliant move by him, because the reality of it is he can agitate for a trade, he can ask to be traded, he can be unhappy in Cleveland, but they were under no obligation to either trade him or to give him more money. The only leverage that Myles Garrett would have would be to not show up for work. And I do think that he's one of those handful of players in the league that's made enough money and has enough cachet, enough stature to make money off of just his mere name, image, and likeness. And I'm not talking about obviously college NIL. I'm talking about just the concept of name, image, and likeness, which is all being an influencer these days is making money off of your name, image, and likeness. He is a significant enough player and name at this point to where he probably and has made enough money in his career at this point to where he could survive sitting out a year just fine. Whereas most players who try this, it's probably not a good idea. Probably not even a good idea for somebody as rich as Myles Garrett. But he could have done that, and that would have been his only leverage. But the fact is, the Browns were under no obligation to meet any of his quote unquote demands, but he was still able to parlay his discontent, his dissatisfaction with the organization into the richest contract in NFL history for any non-quarterback. And so this is a plus move for Myles Garrett. Who's to say that he for sure would have been traded to a team that, hey, like maybe they're better than the Browns, but the Browns did go to the playoffs the year before this past one. They got knocked out by the Texans, but it's not like he would have gone somewhere where it was a guarantee that he would get past, say, the divisional round of the playoffs or the wild card round of the playoffs. So being traded does not guarantee that he's a contender. Like I know a lot of folks had him on the Eagles and just trying to put him on the teams that are going to contend, but they're not in an obligation to trade Myles Garrett. And so far as they do trade him, or if they were to trade him, they get to trade him to the spot that makes the most sense for them, like the highest bidder, what makes most sense for the team, not necessarily Myles Garrett. So you can trade Myles Garrett and maybe you get him out of Cleveland and he's happier to be out of Cleveland, but that doesn't guarantee that you send him somewhere that he actually wants to be. You just pay Myles Garrett and he's somewhere where he doesn't want to be, but at least he's paid handsomely for it. The Browns are this is what I'm calling now just the Browns tax. The Browns got to pay the Browns tax to either get players to come there, in like in the case of Deshaun Watson, where they had to give up all of those draft picks, or felt like at least they had to give up all of those draft picks and guarantee his entire contract for $200+ million, which is biting them in the ass now. Or in the case of Myles Garrett, money whipping them to get him to stay there to pay that and having to pay that Browns tax. It just costs a lot for them to have good players. That's the situation that they're in. I don't blame Myles Garrett for that. Like I don't. This to me was a very savvy business move. Everything costs. Misery costs. Okay, so what are you willing to pay me for my misery? And the Browns did not have to do it, and Myles Garrett was able to get that done. I think that is one of the more impressive things. Like a lot of folks are like, man, he ain't stand on business. He said he wanted to be traded. He said he wanted to win and all of that. Man, look, they didn't have to send him nowhere where they would have won. They didn't have to send him nowhere at all, much less nowhere where they would have won, where he would have had a chance to win. Now at least he's comfortable. Now at least he's the richest guy in the NFL that doesn't play quarterback. I think it is a very savvy move by Myles Garrett. And look, everybody thinks of the Browns as a joke, but nobody thinks of Myles Garrett as a joke. Nobody thinks of Kevin Stefanski as a joke. Nobody thinks of Denzel Ward as a joke. They got guys there that are able to individually keep some respect on their name, despite the fact that they're Browns. So good for them. Another move that was really big was Josh Allen getting paid again. And look, man, this is one of those where you're like, okay, so what does this mean? What is CJ Stroud going to get? Now the interesting part for Josh Allen is the $250 million guaranteed to him over the next 6 years. Now his average annual value is a little bit less than what Dak Prescott signed last year. I think it's around 60 million. So that's been like the number that we talk about whenever CJ Stroud gets his contract. Josh Allen goes for $55 million on annual value on the average. But the potential for this deal, if I have this correct, is $330 million with $250 million guaranteed over the next 6 years. It's the largest guarantee in NFL history. That's what you turned your MVP season into. There is another legend at the bank. There is another winner here. Look, that's somebody that just got like Myles Garrett, just got a contract that was not necessary, that the team did not have to do. But it is a deal that takes care of Josh Allen. But also, I think within it is something that Allen and the team is going to be flexible with in terms of how they build the team around him. They know that he's going to be there. They expect him to be there. They got him under contract, guaranteeing him a boatload of money, and they can navigate how that money gets dispersed based off of what their what the salary cap and what their situation looks like on a given year. Not only does Josh Allen get paid, but the Bills also part ways with Von Miller, but bring in Joey Bosa. I was about to do the thing that I do where I call the wrong brother's name. Like if I know you and your brother's name, I call you by the other brother's name. Almost called him Nick, but this one's Joey. Nick's still in San Francisco, and Joey Bosa is headed to the Buffalo Bills on a deal, a 1-year deal that has $12 million guaranteed, and I think up to $15 million in potential earnings on the deal. I think that's a hell of a signing for the Buffalo Bills. They're going to be, I think, just as good as they were this past year, still trying to knock down the Chiefs, and they've got just as good of a chance of doing it this year as they did last year. I know it's like the boogeyman, and a lot of people look at the AFC as a conference where a lot of these great quarterbacks are going to cannibalize each other, but the Bills got to feel really good about their chances after the year that they had when there was questions about what the weapons around Josh Allen are going to look like and how are they going to replicate the production and success that they had when Stephon Diggs first got there and all of that. Like, to hell with all of that, man. That is a team that, as long as Josh Allen is at quarterback, is going to be relevant and appears to be taking the defensive side of the ball very seriously in letting Von Miller, who is, just it's past time, right? Letting Von Miller go and bringing in a Bosa brother that should definitely bolster their defensive unit. Now, a little bit closer to home, the headline that was interesting to me was the Colts signing Daniel Jones to what I saw was a 1-year, $14 million deal. And that is a hell of a lot for a backup quarterback. That is not quite starter money, but it is more than backup money. And so, what exactly does the Daniel Jones signing mean? The Daniel Jones signing by the Indianapolis Colts mean for Anthony Richardson and his time there? This is one to monitor, because I know in the days leading up to this, when I was seeing some of the initial reporting about what Daniel Jones's options were, it was being painted as or portrayed as like a sweepstakes. It's down to returning to the Vikings or going to the Colts. And it just comes down like it was framed as if there was a competitive sweepstakes for Daniel Jones's services, where in the moment I'm thinking, well, he's the backup no matter where he goes, is specifically with those two spots, right? Like, he's I would figure that even if Minnesota brought him back, they would be more inclined to go with JJ McCarthy, especially after his lost rookie year. And I mean, I know that the Anthony Richardson thing did not work out as well as they wanted it to in Indianapolis this year, but I figured they were still gonna probably go with that in year 3. Or if not, if they were gonna go to an established veteran and starter, it would be somebody maybe better than Daniel Jones. But nah, based off of the $14 million that they're giving him and what we understand the feeling to be around Anthony Richardson, is a feeling of disappointment and uncertainty around whether this project is ever going to actually be worth the investment. This is something to monitor. This is something to watch out for, because I could absolutely see where Daniel Jones either beats Anthony Richardson in the initial competition, or once things go south with Anthony Richardson, it's a short leash. And hey, we got this $14 million backup that we can throw in the game who does have some experience. So that's an interesting one. But in terms of how it impacts the Texans, because it does, I love it. I love it. Like, I don't feel like they got really a whole lot better at that position, or at least like they became threatening at that position, whether it's Anthony Richardson or Daniel Jones. And the Texans defense is damn good. And by the way, just got better in adding CJ Gardner-Johnson in a trade for a player that I don't think was going to play for them next year. So yeah, I'm not necessarily rooting for Daniel Jones's or Anthony Richardson's personal failure. I don't want them to do well if they're on the Colts, going up against the Texans. But my honest feeling about it is that this is not gonna yield what they wanted to. Shane Steichen's a good offensive coach. He's shown that he can work with lesser quarterbacks, but I don't think that that's going to be good enough for the Colts to legitimately threaten the Texans, if the Texans actually go out there and stay true to form. So that is an exciting one. the biggest threat to the Texans in the AFC South doesn't really at this point feel like much of a threat at all because they got quarterback problems. All the teams in the division have quarterback problems. We'll see what Tennessee ends up doing with that number one overall pick and how things work out there. But as it stands right now, that position for every team, not the Texans in that division, is in shambles, and signing Daniel Jones does not exactly change that for me. The last thing that I want to get to, and this is just a question that I want to throw out to the audience because I'm legitimately curious of what y'all's answer would be. Would you rather have Sam Darnold or Geno Smith? Let me try that again. Who would you rather have? Sam Darnold or Geno Smith? It sounds like a question that is not all that worthwhile because you're like, man, if I can improve at that position, if either one of those guys are my quarterback, I'm looking toward the future, like looking toward like they're a placeholder, and I'm looking toward who the next guy might be. I could see that being the feeling, but this is a relevant question because the Las Vegas Raiders, decided that the answer to their quarterback issues was to trade for Geno Smith. And for whatever reason, Seattle was down to trade Geno Smith to the Las Vegas Raiders. Then Seattle decides that the answer for them at quarterback after trading Geno Smith is to sign Sam Darnold. And so if you're following the math here, Sam Darnold was a free agent. Geno Smith was not, was on the Seahawks. Seattle could have simply kept Geno Smith, and the Raiders could have been interested and or signed Sam Darnold. Now, of course, trading for Geno Smith ensures them Geno Smith. And if you're trying to sign Sam Darnold in free agency, of course, you're competing against whatever other teams might want to sign Sam Darnold. So from the Raiders standpoint, it makes sense, not just player to player, but also the certainty of, hey, trading for a guy that we feel like is at least a reliable option at this position. But who would you just straight up rather have? Because I'm trying to figure out what the hell Seattle is thinking about this, right? Like for the Raiders, I would rather trade for Geno Smith than sign Sam Darnold. For Seattle, I would rather keep Geno Smith than sign Sam Darnold, even if I can acknowledge that Sam Darnold, the season that he had last year with Minnesota, is better than any season that Geno Smith has ever had. I can acknowledge that. And of course, Sam Darnold is something like 7 years younger than Geno Smith, which is, I think, significant enough, like a significant enough difference to note, to point out for that to matter. Okay. If it was 3 or 4 years, but 7 years is a lot. Okay. Geno Smith, something like 30, 34, 35 years old, right? 34, I think it is. And Sam Darnold in that 27 range. Like there's 7 years apart. That's enough to care about. So those two things do matter. But at the end of it, like bottom line or big picture, like does either guy, like, is your ceiling not similar with either guy? And honestly, would you not rather the consistency that you've seen from Geno Smith now over the past 3 seasons, has it been, as the starter? Right? Is that it? Because you've got the 2 seasons that Russ was in Denver, and then the 1 season in Philly. So, or I'm sorry, the 1 season in Pittsburgh. So that's 3 seasons that Russ has been gone. So 3 seasons for Geno Smith as the starter. He, again, has not had a season, I think, quite as good. They threw for around the same amount of yards this year. Geno Smith and Sam Darnold, I want to say there's like a difference of 1 yard between the two of them in passing yards. But Sam Darnold threw for way more touchdowns and for fewer interceptions than Geno Smith did. It was a better season. But I would also point out that he was in a much, much, much better situation out there in Minnesota. like you create a situation like that for Geno Smith, I think you can get a similar type of production that you got out of Sam Darnold, right? Like the offensive line for Minnesota, better than Seattle's. The weapons, the wide receiving options for Minnesota. You got Justin Damn Jefferson and Jordan Addison out there, better than what Seattle had. And then of course, because the offensive line was better, I think you also had better overall a better overall run game with Minnesota. Now, I feel like their run game kind of tailed off a little bit toward the end of the season, and if you look at the stats, it's not like a demonstrative difference between the overall production in terms of the run game. But like the Seattle, just from what I can tell, didn't like the. I know their offensive line wasn't very good, but they just didn't feel like they ran a lot of plays. Like they were close to the bottom in both passing and rushing attempts in all of the NFL. So they just weren't doing a whole lot offensively, and they just didn't have a whole lot offensively. Sam Darnold had an embarrassment of riches in Minnesota, and I think you can contribute the difference in type of season that he had in 2024 versus what Geno Smith has had to work with in Seattle, and certainly what he had to work with in his days with the Jets, and really when he just hadn't quite necessarily figured it out, and they were a dumpster fire as an organization. On top of that, like Geno Smith just has not been in a situation as ideal. And I didn't even mention Kevin O'Connell as the play caller and play designer. Like he just has not been in a situation as good as that. So like I hesitate to use the season that Sam Darnold had as like this marker for him being the better of the two failed former Jets quarterbacks. But I could see how maybe Seattle might do it, and I can see how maybe they might think that the answer is trying to recreate the sort of environment that Sam Darnold excelled in when he was in Minnesota. But like out of the two, I really want to know, who would you rather have, Sam Darnold or Geno Smith? Right? Like I to me, this made sense for the Raiders. I don't know what Seattle is doing. I don't know what's the unless it's just a complete rebuild of the situation, and they're gonna have Sam Darnold in there as a placeholder until they really get this thing figured out, or maybe just use it as a trial year to figure out if Sam Darnold there's actually something there, like it wasn't fool. Because a lot of us, the way things ended with Sam Darnold in Minnesota, feel like a lot of that was fool's gold. Like is that the case? Do they feel like they can get the most out of him? I don't know, but it is a very, very, very curious decision to me by Seattle. And of course, they traded DK Metcalf. I didn't even mention that, but the DK Metcalf deal to the Steelers, I think really signals, and they made they've made a couple of moves in Seattle that signal a bit of a rebuild, a bit of a changing of the guard, if you will. But this is not one that I think was the wisest or the smartest. Now, I didn't mention, I'm just now mentioning DK to Pittsburgh. I'm intrigued by that too. Like I don't know what their quarterback situation is going to be. I don't know if it's going to be Aaron Rodgers. I don't know if it's going to be Russell Wilson. I don't know if it's going to be like just somebody that we haven't thought of yet. But they damn sure got to figure that out. They damn sure got to figure that out, because like that seemed to be the position that's been holding them back for years. And I don't know, like for DK Metcalf, the difference in Seattle and Pittsburgh is just maybe a better possibility at a playoff berth, but ultimately your floor is higher, but your ceiling is ultimately the same until they figure out that quarterback situation. Like he doesn't have a quarterback better than Geno Smith. He doesn't have a quarterback better than Sam Darnold, because that dude ended up going to the team that he just came from. So yeah, very, very interesting times in the NFL with all the musical chairs. I've talked about it, I think, way more and longer than I actually intended to. And I'll tell you this: the next episode, I'm gonna touch on some of the changes that I'm sure all of you guys are aware of at Sports Radio 610, at Odyssey. Like, I'm not gonna speak out of term and give y'all a whole lot of internal business, a lot of, what you might call, quote unquote, family business. We're not gonna do that here on the podcast because that would just be straight up foolish. But I do think it is worthwhile to discuss how the changes are going to ultimately impact this podcast, because as y'all are aware, I have been doing the H-Town Hoops podcast. Adam Spillane, my co-host on the H-Town Hoops podcast, and my colleague, former colleague now at Sports Radio 610, was unfortunately let go last week. And I want to talk about it because I love Adam to death, both as a colleague, and I consider him a friend. I hope he considers me the same. But I want to touch on a couple of things, both how it's going to impact the podcast and some of the stuff that we're going to be doing here on the B Block, now that I do not anticipate doing the H-Town Hoops podcast any longer, with Adam Spillane not being employed by the company, but also just what I think some of these changes in media mean and represent, what it means for me, and how I feel about some of it and what I think it represents. So I think that'll be a fun episode if you're into that sort of thing when we talk next. But for now, this has been the B Block. I was almost going to call it the H-Town Hoops podcast because I'm used to doing that as well. But this one has been the B Block podcast with your boy. And I did that for my guy, Jay Michaels, who put out something on social media saying the guys over 20 shouldn't be calling themselves your boy. I actually agree with you, Jay. So I just did that to kind of mess with you a little bit. But this has been the B Block podcast. Make sure that you subscribe, rate, review, tell a friend, check us out and catch us on YouTube. That is. And until next time, y'all be